We are very grateful that Ankita Shanker is joining us today from the Netherlands. Ankita earned her postgraduate degree in law from Oxford University and is now a doctoral fellow working on an interdisciplinary PhD titled Resolving Inconsistencies Within the Law to Safeguard the Fundamental Rights of Non-Human Animals. She also acts as a pro bono consultant, composing law and policy recommendations to the EU on behalf of the Dutch Coalition of Animal NGOs and as an advisor to a number of NGOs. Ankita's research and practice are dedicated to safeguarding the fundamental rights of all rights bearers. In her presentation today, Ankita will discuss the discrepancy between those who hold fundamental rights and those whose rights are formally recognized and legally protected. Please welcome Ankita Shanker.
Thank you to Bianca for that lovely introduction, to ICAR for having me here, and to everyone who is here for being here. I'd like to start with a story based on true events. This is the story of captive number 2910, or so says the branding on her skin. She is the quintessential dairy cow, living in one of the better welfare farms in Europe. This already means that 2910 has it considerably better than many captive cows who live chained up in tiny, dirty pens with no room to stretch or even to lie down. On the surface, 2910's life seems okay. She is allowed to graze for a part of the year, unlike many captive cows who never feel the warmth of the sun or the cool breeze of the wind on their skin. What more could she want, right? Well, 2910 is forcibly impregnated every year. This starts before her body is even safely capable of producing offspring. She is artificially inseminated, her human tormentor elbow deep in her body, armed with a device you might find in the torture cell of some killer's soundproof basement. She is sexually exploited so she can produce offspring, and thus produce milk which her captors can use to sell to make a profit. As a result of her ordeal, 2910 suffers from a number of physical health conditions. The process of her domestication has resulted in unnaturally large udders, which cause her constant pain. The frequent childbirth and milk production have naturally weakened her body. She suffers from mastitis, caused by a bacterial infection in her udders. She suffers from lameness because of the unnatural environment in which she is held captive. But the horrors don't end here. Because once 2910 has given birth, her baby is taken from her within 24 hours and moved to a pen. 2 weeks later, the baby is removed from the farm. The very first time this happened, 2910 chased down the truck carrying her child away for miles. Crushed by the loss, she wailed inconsolably for 3 days, refusing to eat or to drink. Another time, 2910 gave birth to twins. Knowing full well what was in store, she tried to hide one in the vain hope that at least one baby might be saved. Neither was. Her baby girl was taken away to be a dairy cow, to share in her fate of repeated abuse and trauma. And her baby boy was shipped off and, while still a baby, had his throat slit open and his body hung upside down from a hook to be drained of blood, to amuse someone's taste buds for a 20-minute course in their meal. At least 2910's ordeal will be over someday though, but it will not be a peaceful or natural death, because after many cycles of abuse, 2910 will be declared spent and killed at about a quarter of her natural lifespan. Captive 2910's story is the story of millions of dairy cattle. Not only is it legal to hold them captive, to exploit their reproductive systems and their maternal instincts for profit, and to abduct, abuse, and even kill their children, it is partly funded through grants and subsidies from domestic and multinational governments world over, which means it is partly funded through taxes from you and I. If we stopped abusing 2910 and others like her, what is the worst that could happen? Well, cows might take over the planet, of course. All hail our future bovine overlords. That doesn't sound right, does it? Because everyone knows our future overlords are cats. If we modify a few details of 2910's story, it is also the story of literally countless non-human animals who are legally bred or captured into confinement, who are abused and tortured and killed, all in the name of food, science, art, culture, sport, without a second thought. When we are surrounded by injustice and, indifference, it is not enough to simply not participate. The world needs changing. The laws and the policies that govern human activities need changing. We must change them. So today, I want to discuss how the recognition and the protection of fundamental rights has evolved over time, reaching a point where all human beings are beneficiaries, but non-human animals are somehow excluded from its scope. My position is that the law should continue to evolve until the fundamental rights of all rights holders, human and non-human, are formally recognized and legally protected. Towards the end of this presentation, I will also address why we need to respect animal rights, not just as animal rights, but also as a means of solving the world's most pressing problems, which pose threats to human health, to the planet, and to human access to food. And in the interest of time, I've had to forego fully exploring some of the underpinning theories and the conceptual analysis. So if anything is unclear, please feel free to ask me during the Q&A at the end. First, I would like to acquaint everyone with what exactly I mean when I use the 5 terms listed on this slide. By animals, I mean all members of the animal kingdom with the exception of Homo sapiens. Humans are then Homo sapiens. Fundamental rights are those inherent rights which, unlike juristic ones, do not need to be conferred externally by the law, although they do need the protection and the recognition of the law. These rights are generally capable of generating new rights and duties to protect the underlying interest. Sentience is the most basic form of consciousness or awareness, and I use it to entail the capacity to experience feelings or perceptions. And by exploitation, essentially, I mean subjugating another's interest to serve one's own by making the other a means for one's ends. We need to talk about animal rights. And I can demonstrate why with 2 common arguments against veganism or animal rights or what have you. The first argument goes that my personal choice to exploit animals should be respected. Now, this demonstrates a failure to consider animal interests entirely. The hypocrisy is staggering, the arrogance amusing, but the underlying reason is quite unsettling. Because foremost, it is not just a personal choice when the choice leaves a trail of victims in its path. No matter how hungry I am or craving a mid-afternoon snack, I cannot simply pop over to my neighbors and eat their food, or even them. And secondly, if it is a genuine choice, so here I exclude scenarios in which there is no realistic alternative for survival, then there is something fundamentally wrong about demanding respect for the choice to participate in the systematic abuse of innocent victims, for mere enjoyment, no less. And by enjoyment, I include enjoyment of the taste buds. Anyone who can make this argument obviously isn't carrying out any objective balancing exercise between the competing rights, likely because they've either never considered animal rights or as possible things that might exist, or because they've considered them and concluded that animal rights are irrelevant. If I were to think that my choice to exploit another trumps my victim's choice to not be exploited, not only should no one respect that, but I would probably need to take a long, hard look at my reasoning. Argument 2 conflates animal rights with animal welfare and goes like this. The animals that I exploit are treated well. And I have honestly had people try to justify riding captive elephants on vacation in this way. I've had people try to justify eating meat of animals specifically killed for that meat in this way. Aside from the absurdity in claiming that any captive animal can possibly be treated well, the failure to understand that the exploitation is a problem is a problem. If I were to abduct and keep a young human child captive, I would be wrong, notwithstanding my treatment of the child otherwise, and regardless of the child's ability to understand that they were being exploited. because it is an issue of human rights. And before I continue, I'll run off into a brief tangent on why I maintain that comparing animal suffering with human suffering should not raise eyebrows in principle, although it sometimes does. Now, first of all, we can compare things to highlight similarities or to highlight differences between them. And even comparing by highlighting similarities is not the same as equating the things. Things being compared can still have differences in addition to their similarities. Secondly, acknowledging the experiences or suffering of other groups of rights holders for what they are in no way illegitimizes or detracts from the experiences of, or suffering of any other group. And I say this as a woman who has lived in patriarchal societies. I say this as an ethnic minority living in the Western world. And I say this as an ethical minority living in a largely non-vegan world. I'm not someone who has not been discriminated against, and I am not someone who has not suffered because of the way I look or for the values I hold. And finally, many times, the objection comes from this knee-jerk attempt to put distance between humans and animals, so people can feel less guilty about exploiting animals. And this is something we should try to understand and to resist the urge to do. So back to my example. No matter how well I were to treat this child, or how little this child understood of what was happening to them, it would still be morally unacceptable because it would still entail wrongful confinement. And this is true of captive animals world over, who would, if given the chance, rather be free to live their natural lives and engage in their natural behaviors without any adverse interference. The scale, gravity, and legality of animal exploitation makes it the prime contender for the worst abuse in the world today. Our treatment of animals raises a rights issue, and society is simply not having this dialogue, which we really do need to be having, because animals are sentient. They have individual personalities, they have subjective experiences, but legally they're treated as property and are made to suffer extensively for human uses. The best case scenario under existing frameworks is welfare protection, which is very limited by its nature and its scope, and while it is certainly better than nothing, it is nowhere close to being enough. Animal welfare treats the symptoms of animal abuse, but the only way to eradicate the underlying disease is to cure the disease. So, then we ask the question, who holds fundamental rights? And here I will quote from my ongoing doctoral work. All sentient beings have fundamental rights in order to protect the interests that are perceived through their consciousness. The nature and content of these rights are relevant to protecting these interests, and the maximum limits of these rights are determined by the minimum requirements to protect the corresponding rights of other rights holders. This is an unbelievably convoluted statement. So let's break it down into sections. The who is all sentient beings, and I adopt a default position that all animals are sentient until proven otherwise. And this may be the case for species such as corals or sea jellies. And I create this rebuttable presumption. I use it for three reasons. One is the more precautionary principle. We should do so out of an abundance of caution. Two is the long human history of exploiting animals, who we later found out had been suffering all along. This is true in the case of fish and mollusks and crustaceans, for instance. Now, even today, we've recognized the sentience of these species, but these animals are not generally protected by cruelty laws in most parts of the world because it takes too long to change laws. So these sentient animals are still suffering for human uses with no protection whatsoever. And third is that the harm that comes from adopting the reverse position in terms of animal suffering will far outweigh the material cost of adopting a few precautions on our part. So the what is the fundamental rights I mentioned 2 slides ago. The why is so we can protect the underlying interests that animals can perceive through their subjective experiences. The nature and the content of these rights, again, are determined by the same underlying interests, and the scope of the rights are determined by the rights of other rights holders. So I will draw on Ripstein's sovereignty principle, which identifies violations of equal freedom as the legitimate basis for criminalization, to conclude that all rights holders, human and animal, should be free to exercise their rights to the maximum possible extent they desire, subject only to the limitation that this must not interfere with the equal freedom of other rights holders to exercise their own rights. So why then do animals hold fundamental rights? I will start this with a quote from Jeremy Bentham. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being? Why indeed? The matter is of sentience, not of sapience. I rely on three premises to reach the conclusion that since humans have fundamental rights, so do animals. To dispute this conclusion, we would have to dispute one or more of the premises leading to it. So in order to deprive animals of fundamental rights, we would have to either rely on competence to deny likeness and challenge premise 2, or on speciesism to ignore that likeness and challenge premise 3. Now, premise 1 is that humans have fundamental rights. It doesn't make a lot of sense to try to challenge this because our legal systems are largely built around this notion. There's a universal declaration and everything. It's been around since 1948. Premise 2 is that animals are like humans. So we could come up with endless lists of differences. But we need to ask whether there is any difference in any way that is relevant for the purposes of fundamental rights. In fact, a quick side note here. So we often come across arguments that are relied on to demonstrate how exceptionally suited humans are for fundamental rights. And would those arguments actually serve us in the case of humans who will say die before they can ever be considered moral agents or before they can engage in the functions that are characteristic of that special type of intelligence attributed to humans? For instance, terminally ill infants or others who permanently lack these capacities. And what about those arguments when we consider animals, such as whales, with the cognition of 11-year-old humans, who are killed with harpoons that physically tear them apart on the inside over the course of agonizing days or even weeks? What about octopuses with the cognition of 6-year-old humans, eaten and dismembered and cooked alive by people, and that are now being raised in farms? The octopuses, not the people. Or pigs with the cognition of 3-year-old humans, exploited in ways with which we are probably familiar. Rights exist to protect interests, which presupposes two things. One, that there be some interest to protect on pain of experiencing disadvantage from deprivation. And two, that there be some capacity, even if it is merely theoretical or potential, to enjoy or to exercise rights. The emphasis is thus on experience, enjoyment, exercise, all things that point to sentience, nothing more and nothing less. Animals are provenly sentient, and questioning this puts us back in the 19th century. So animals are, in the relevant sense, like humans. And premise 3, like things are to be treated alike. This derives from an accepted legal maxim. Without relevant differences as a distinguishing factor, the only possible reason for denying animals fundamental rights is speciesism. And by analogy with other supremacist notions, such as sexism or racism, we know that this has no place in the rhetoric of fundamental rights. We thus have no choice but to conclude that since humans have fundamental rights, so do animals. Having established that animals do have fundamental rights, just like humans, we have to then ask whose fundamental rights are legally and formally recognized and protected. So I will begin this part with a quote from J.S. Mill. It often happens that the universal belief of one age of mankind, a belief from which no one was, nor without an extraordinary effort of genius and courage could at the time be free, becomes to a subsequent age so palpable an absurdity that the only difficulty then is to imagine how such a thing can ever have appeared credible. Historically, there was no universal protection of human rights. Here are examples from some early human rights documents in the Middle Ages that demonstrate this point. So first we have the Magna Carta from 1215 England. And this afforded the broadest protection, actually Middle Ages to modern times, broadest protection to the free man. So this partially excluded women who did not get equal rights protection until 1968, and also excluded serfs, because serfdom was not abolished in England until 1574, when Queen Elizabeth I freed the last of the serfs. From America, we have the Declaration of Independence of 1776, the Constitution of 1787, and the Bill of Rights of 1791. The Declaration allegedly protected all men on an equal basis, but implicitly it still partially excluded women, who again didn't get equal rights protection until the late 20th century, and it excluded enslaved persons because slavery wasn't abolished in America until 1865 with the 13th Constitutional Amendment, and equal rights protection for African Americans was not granted until 1968. From France, we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen from 1789, and this gave the broadest protection to active citizens, but implicitly partially excluded women. Again, no equal rights protection until the 20th century, and non-propertied men, and excluded enslaved people because slavery in France wasn't abolished until 1784, and then once again in 1848. So what we can see from these examples is that preserving the status quo is obviously beneficial from oppressors, but it is a weak reason to deny the oppressed their rights. We've had a group of humans who managed to claim power in that time, at that place, seeking to do two things. One was to protect their own interests and the interests of their own in-groups, and the other was to safeguard their own ability to subjugate others whose oppression made the pursuit of their own selfish interests a bit easier. So to do that, they have sought to attempt to justify excluding others from protection. They've done this by asserting these groups, this sex or this race or this gender, this ethnicity or this class or what have you, were less intelligent or less capable or even less able to experience suffering. It shows a disturbing willingness to use baseless or pointless arguments to try and strengthen the domination of oppressors. Do these arguments sound familiar? They should, because they are what mainstream society still uses today in the context of subjugating animals. However, things changed. There were triggers, there were movements, there were all sorts of efforts by people, enough of whom realized it was wrong to try to change the system. So we have women's rights movements which began the end of gender discrimination. We had abolitionist movements to try and end slavery, and we have civil rights movements that waged a war on racial discrimination, and it is one we are still fighting today. We've had rebellions, revolts, and we've had wars. We had the Peasants' Revolt of 1831 that ended serfdom in England, and the American Civil War to end slavery in America. And these examples show us that it took time, because change always takes time. I believe the last country to criminalize slavery only did so in 2007. But as a result of these efforts, we also had law and policy changes, not just at the domestic level, but also significantly on the international stage. We saw declarations, a few examples of which you can find on your slides from these are the first sort of modern human rights instruments. So the declarations weren't typically legally binding, but they still do recognize rights. And then they were followed by treaties, which were legally binding agreements between countries. And they created obligations on these countries to protect rights. So there are, of course, also other sources of international law that protect human rights. The prohibition against enslavement and against torture, at least in some contexts, have now also attained the status of escutcheons or peremptory norms of international law, which means that there is no derogation ever permitted from these norms. However, these are relatively recent developments. They recognize and they protect the universal rights of all humans on an equal basis, which is fantastic, but not yet animals, which is less fantastic, because it is apparently still legally permissible to abuse and exploit non-human animals in a way that is now absolutely forbidden in the context of humans. So I will end this section with a quote from Dmitry Mazurovsky, which says that the time shall come when all men will be content with a vegetable diet and will think on the murder of animals as they now think on the murder of men. That time could not come fast enough. This is a visual representation of the problem. It isn't to scale. The blue shape should be infinitely larger than the purple one in the middle. I imagine this is the same problem that people trying to figure out how to depict Jupiter and scale down models of the solar system faced. But the problem is that the law is failing to treat like things alike because it isn't affording its protection to all those to whom it owes protection. We have to ask ourselves whether it's morally acceptable for us as individuals to exploit what we know is a failure of the law to protect an entire class of rights holders. And while we should, of course, respect animal rights for the sake of animal rights, pragmatically, I will also emphasize links with other areas, not least because it is a useful approach in animal advocacy. As listed on these slides are some problems faced due to our disregard for animals and for their habitats. And these problems can pose existential threats to humans, and they do. I'll issue a disclaimer before proceeding. I'm not actually an expert on any of the topics that will follow, but what I have done is I've tried to gather the conclusions of independent and reliable experts, especially meta-analysis, as far as I could find from the sources available when I was gathering this information. So the first issue then is human health, specifically antimicrobial resistant and zoonoses. We know that these things are undesirable. They kill people, a lot of them, and they're very hard to kill themselves. So from an environmental standpoint, from an existential standpoint, this is not great. Antimicrobial resistance occurs when microbes mutate and become resistant to antimicrobials that could once kill them. And this can result from an overuse of antimicrobials and can result in creating superbugs, which can then kill us. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, AMR is a major global threat of increasing concern. 2/3 of the estimated future growth of usage of antimicrobials is estimated to be within the animal production sector. Zoonoses are diseases that originate in animals and are spread to humans, with which we're likely very familiar given the events that have been dominating the news since sort of the end of 2019, 2020, COVID-19. So zoonotic diseases typically jump species from wild animals to humans via livestock, or animals we rear as livestock. According to the United Nations Environment Program, zoonotic diseases are increasing rapidly, and human activities such as animal product consumption, animal agriculture, domestication and selective breeding of animals, taming of animals, encroachment into wildlife, loss of biodiversity, climate change, and others are the main drivers of zoonosis. According to the World Health Organization, the greatest risk for zoonotic disease transmission occurs at the human-animal interface. Through direct or indirect human exposure to animals, their products like milk, meat, and eggs, and or their environments. Here are some statistics that illustrate how magnificently huge this problem is. According to the UNEP, on average, a new infectious disease emerges in humans every 4 months. Zoonoses are also responsible for millions of deaths and 1 billion illnesses per year, and account for 75% of emerging infectious diseases and 60% of infectious diseases. 75% of the new pathogens detected in the past 30 years have also originated in animals. This is terrifying. We move on to human health from the perspective of individual health conditions, or with the focus on individual health conditions. Here we see that various independent organizations have found causal links between the consumption of animal products, such as meat, fish, dairy, and eggs, and serious and even fatal human health conditions, such as Alzheimer's, cancers, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, neurotoxicity, osteoporosis, and others. And some of these organizations I've kind of listed on the slide down here. So the first slide in this, the second slide in this topic depicts some substances and their corresponding carcinogenic categorizations given by the International Agency for Research on Cancer in publications that were distributed by the WHO. As we can see, Chinese-style salted fish and processed meat have been classified as group 1 carcinogenics, which means that their links with cancer are as conclusively established as for tobacco or asbestos. It also means that there's established, the studies also found that there were established links to colorectal cancer and possible links to stomach and bowel cancers. Red meat has been classed in group 2A, which means it is probably carcinogenic, with probable links to colorectal cancer and possible links to stomach and bowel cancers. According to the WHO, the risk increases with the amount of meat that's consumed, but the data available for evaluation do not permit a conclusion about whether a safe level exists. This next slide shows that several studies have found issues with other animal products as well. So with dairy products, studies have found them to be not or minimally linked with benefit to bone health, and studies have also linked them with weakened bones, with fractures, and an increased risk of prostate cancer and earlier death. Studies have linked eggs strongly with cardiovascular disease, have linked them with high cholesterol, have linked them also with increased risk for diabetes and increased risk for a deadly form of prostate cancer. Meat, whether red or white, has been linked with high cholesterol, and seafood. The major concern that we sort of hear about is, the most common concern we hear about is the toxicity with which it is linked from environmental contaminants, such as neurological toxicity from methylmercury. Seafood is essentially associated with contamination caused by human activities and natural processes, including inorganic compounds and persistent organic pollutants. And we also know that it could be contaminated with microplastics, and this is a problem of which we've become aware relatively recently. So these animal products have nutrients, but research indicates that they can also harm human health. And the information I found suggests that we can get our required nutrients from other sources as well, which is certainly something to look into. So even purely from the health perspective, human society really should be eliminating our dependence on harmful animal products and trying to find safer forms of nutrition. For instance, we can look to blue zones to help come up with solutions. Now, blue zones are regions where the residents on average live the longest and the healthiest lives. And what's interesting is that the diets of blue zones are primarily, if not exclusively, and by this I mean 95 to 100% plant-based. There's also a study titled "The Most Comprehensive Study of Nutrition Ever Conducted," which concluded that whole food plant-based diets are better for health. Then we move on to impacts on the environment, starting with the Anthropocene extinction. So the Earth is undergoing its 6th mass extinction, which the last of these was the one that killed off the dinosaurs. According to a report by Sandra Diaz and others, 25% of life on Earth, in the form of 1 billion species, are under threat of global extinction as a result of human actions. The report also states that the rate of global change in nature during the last 50 years is unprecedented in human history. The direct drivers of climate change in nature with the largest global impact have been, starting with those with the most impact, changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasion of alien species. All these drivers can be linked to animal exploitation, either directly or indirectly. Beyond the mass extinction, we also have environmental degradation as a problem. According to the UNEP, the destructive impact of animal agriculture on our environment far exceeds that of any other technology on Earth. The greenhouse gas footprint of animal agriculture rivals that of every car, truck, bus, ship, airplane, and rocket ship combined. According to the website of Cowspiracy, the facts, which refers in turn to various sources, animal agriculture is the leading cause of species extinction, ocean dead zones, water pollution, and habitat destruction. All things that we saw in the previous slide were responsible for our current mass extinction. And here are some statistics gathered from the websites of Our World in Data and Cowspiracy, and they depict sort of the contribution of animal agriculture to land use. Animal agriculture accounts for 77% of direct agricultural land use. In turn, it only contributes 37% to the global protein supply and 18% to the global calorie supply. Animal agriculture also uses up 45% of the Earth's total land and is responsible for 91% of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. 1 to 2 acres of this rainforest are cleared per second, which results in the loss of up to 137 different species of flora and fauna per day. Animal agriculture also uses up 28 to 33% of the global freshwater and is responsible for 65% of the global greenhouse emissions from food production and 51% of the global greenhouse emissions in total. Fishing also has a destructive impact on the environment. As of 2018, 90% of the monitored marine fish stocks were fully exploited. 40% of the annual global marine catch results in discards, and this makes up 80% by weight. And ghost fishing gear as of 1997 amounted to 640,000 metric tons, or 10% of marine litter. And today the values will be considerably higher given how much commercial fishing has gone up. Finally, we look to food availability. And here are some statistics again from the website of Cowspiracy. So humans grow enough food to feed 10 billion humans. At least 50% of all grain grown worldwide is fed to animals that are reared as livestock. 82% of starving children live in countries where food is fed to animals that are eaten by Western countries. On 1.5 acres of land, we can grow 37,000 pounds of plant-based foods, but that land will yield 375 pounds of beef. Humans consume 5.2 billion gallons of water per day and 21 billion pounds of food per day. Cows, on the other hand, consume 45 billion gallons of water and 135 billion pounds of food. So what then is the solution? At a societal level, we need to end the exploitation of animals and of their habitats. But at an individual level, we need to end our participation in these things, which is also known as going vegan. According to the Vegan Society, veganism is a way of life is a way of living which seeks to exclude as far as possible and practicable all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. This actually means that veganism is accessible to everyone, though the specifics of how everyone implements it might differ, or at least until we are able to eradicate the historic human dependence on animal exploitation. Veganism is our future because it is the only way we will even have one. And that is it for me today. During the conference, I will address how I think we can try to achieve a world without subjugation through law and policy and activism. But for now, let's brush through my references, which are available if anyone is interested to look up any of the things I've said, and move on to the question and answer segment of the day.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ankita, for this interesting presentation. We now have time for questions. I will read out the questions that have been posted so far, and you can also still add additional questions if you have any. So, and also I would like to add that this presentation will be available on Facebook afterwards, so you can watch it again if you want to. Okay, so the first question is, while the ethical rationale for veganism is undeniable, would you agree that nurture is a significant deterrent to the wider propagation of veganism?
So I think by this question, if I understand it correctly, is sort of asking about the way in which we're raised and sort of the environmental impacts that we have from our cultural upbringing, for example, and whether those things can impact the wider propagation of veganism. And in that, of course, there are people who are raised in vegan households for whom it would be considerably easier to stay on that way. There are people who are raised in cultures and in parts of the world where veganism is unheard of, for whom it would take considerable more effort to learn about veganism and then to adopt the lifestyle. And this is also part of the reason why I think that the way to achieve a vegan world would be through law and policy changes, and not just leave it to individuals to realize for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next question. Can you share the PowerPoint presentation afterwards? It is really interesting.
Oh, thank you. I suppose I could. It's yeah, we could figure out a way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Is it fair to base your argument on the idea that the threshold for proving rights to all sentient beings, among which include animals, is the questions of their suffering, something which is shared by all on the planet?
So I'm just trying to read this question. I think I might have missed it. So in a nutshell, is it fair to base your argument on the idea that the threshold for proving rights to all sentient beings? Could I get a clarification on this? I'm not sure I fully understood the question.
So whoever posted this question, can you please clarify it in the chat room? Maybe ask it slightly different. That would be great. Okay, let's see. Just want to check if we have another question. I'm just checking the chat room to see if there's any more. This is an okay, so I have one question. So in which countries do you see certain potential, or which potentials do you see in certain countries regarding animal rights and like the legal system, the rights system that is possible?
So personally, my familiarity lies with EU countries, and that's sort of what I had been focusing on for my NGO work. And in terms of possibilities of rights protection, so it's this is actually something that fits really that I will be dealing with in my presentation at the conference. But primarily for rights protection, I think we may be a little bit further away from it at the moment. But we could, what I realistically think could happen at the moment is stronger welfare protection and greater sort of awareness and policy recommendations, which will eventually result. And I think the EU, for instance, is a really good organization to push for this, because historically the EU has managed to get protections for animals, and while there's a lot left to be done, it is a fairly strong sort of supranational organization that that has a lot of influence. So I think there would be a lot there, and in the jurisdictions with which I'm familiar, there's already growing discourse among people in terms of animal rights, and there are also, I'm aware of sort of policy recommendations to try to get that, but I think it's kind of difficult to say where I see sort of the most potential and in what areas, because we're still largely at the welfare stage, and generally governments are not really considering rights so much, although I did read a really interesting judgment by a court in Pakistan recently, which discussed sort of animal rights. So it's I suppose to be seen, and we've had some judgments by Indian courts as well that have sought to recognize these rights protection. So I suppose it's sort of a wait and watch to see what happens.
Okay, so we do have some more questions coming in now. Sorry for the delay earlier. So the next question, I will just have to read it to you. Let's see. Okay. So there was a question. First of all, thank you for your presentation, Ankita. Rights. That's the one we had. Okay, so about the recent popularity of regenerative agriculture and the argument that animals have always been a natural component of growing food. An example, their manure, and are therefore a necessary part of the natural world. I assume this use of animals is considered a human interest and is therefore a human right. This is clearly an exploitation of these animals, but how do you argue against their natural world position?
So when I sort of look to, so first I always try to distinguish the notions of sort of use and exploitation. And when I think of animal rights there, for instance, there might be things that animals would discard, and provided that there isn't really any interference with the animals, I wouldn't strictly class that as an exploitation. So there's a little bit of that as well. And I think when we look at these sort of pragmatically, we look at competing interests, we look at animal rights, we look at human rights and the way they're exercised, and it will likely be this sort of gradual process until we, and then that's just a practical reality. That isn't how I think it should be, but that's kind of what we've seen in the world, and we've seen the way social change has been brought about. So that's probably what we will have. But whenever there is an actual exploitation of animals, and that exploitation cannot be justified by the interests of human oppressors. And my position is, and always has been in this regard, is that we are free to exercise our rights, just not at the cost of others. So if that exercise entails exploitation, then that exercise is not legitimate, and it exceeds our rights, so to speak. So that's how I would argue against sort of the, I suppose, the natural world position.
Okay. Okay. So the next question is there a legal challenge from those countries that have declared a climate emergency? That's a way in, or literally, as you say, FRS like?
Fundamental rights like? Okay. So is there a legal challenge from those countries?
They could probably fundamental rights, yes.
So, but the climate emergency, I think when we look at it from a climate perspective, and we look at animal rights from a climate perspective, the idea is always on sort of reducing animal exploitation. And while in policy, it definitely strengthens it, because we have evidence to show that reduced animal welfare, for instance, is also detrimental for the climate. I think there is a way in for getting better animal protection, but if we want sort of a purist notion of animal rights protection, it would come from, in my opinion, the animal rights, it would have to come from the animal rights angle, because we're not angling just for better protection. We're arguing to kind of recognize their fundamental rights, and these are things which would be capable of generating, say, new rights to protect the underlying interests. And as a practical matter, of course, it will be informed by all the other sort of areas that animal exploitation ends up harming, but in principle, I think the bulk of it will have to sort of come from this recognition of animal interests.
Okay. So the next question is, why is sentience the baseline and not sapience? How are they different?
So sentience is sort of just kind of the ability to perceive and to feel and to experience pain and suffering and all the things that are relevant whenever we talk about human rights, we talk about violations, we talk about, it's all has to do with some ability, and that ability could just be potential as, or it might even just be theoretical, but it entails this thing that, so we don't really talk about human rights, say, in the context of a water jug, because it has no subjective experience. And so that's a pretty sort of, maybe we could just use like an argument by analogy to say, well, this is the characteristic of human beings that that is the baseline for their fundamental rights. So it's what we should be employing for animals as well, or basically non-humans generally. So whether they have that capacity to experience. And there's a second part of that question, which I'm just trying to find. Oh, sorry, where is that? Oh, and how are they different? Oh, sapiens. Okay, of course. So sapiens is more about kind of the ability to reason and to think, and has to do more with cognitive functions. So, and it's often an argument that's raised when, when the argument is made that animals are unintelligent, and so it's okay to treat them the way we treat them. The focus of those arguments is on sapiens rather than on sentience. And it's important to remember that it's sentience that actually matters, because it's the one that determines whether the animal is suffering and not sapiens.
Okay, thank you. Are all forms of carnivores eating a form of exploitation of animals, or are we only condemning the slaughterhouse and not the farmhouse?
I hold that all forms of carnivorous eating are exploitation when there is someone, and by someone I mean an animal, who is killed for that purpose. So we go back to sort of exploitation means turning someone into a means for your ends, or pursuing your interest at the cost of someone else. And eating animals, killing someone and eating them obviously falls within the definition of using them as a means for your ends. They don't really get a benefit from being killed and winding up on our dinner plates. So yes, I would definitely say that it is a form of exploitation, and is condemning the slaughterhouse or the farmhouse. The farmhouse, I imagine, where the animals are raised, and the slaughterhouse where they're actually killed. But then the exploitation isn't just about the killing or the slaughter, because exploitation of animals in the farm industry starts from the moment they're bred and from the moment they're, they're born. So it continues through their entire lives, from breeding to birth to the way they're raised. They're held captive, they are bred, and they're sort of raised in captivity just for the end goal of being producing sort of, so we can benefit from their bodily fluids, or that we can benefit from their eggs, or we can benefit from slaughtering them and eating them. So I would be condemning sort of every step of the process that entails that exploitation.
Yeah. Okay. Next question is, where would you start legally? There's no other.
Oh, wow. Where would I start legally? So in practice, my approach has mostly been to try to expand welfare protections while simultaneously working on, because that is sort of an interim measure, right? So what I have realized through my research is that actually getting animal rights recognition might be a bit further away. And in the time that I'm doing my research, and many others like me are actually working to getting animal rights recognition. But while that is going on, the shorter sort of interim measures to kind of quell the exploitation would be welfare protection, would be trying to eradicate some of the worst abuses in the industries that exploit animals. And so that's the temporary things, sort of the band-aids, while we look for a cure for actually ending or trying to end animal exploitation in principle through rights protection. And where I'd start legally, I will actually go into a lot of detail in the actual presentation at the conference. So kind of my approaches and strategies, and I think for a more detailed answer, please do attend that one.
Okay, perfect. So don't miss it. All right, there's another question. Is there a country you think is nearly ready to afford animal rights in law?
Honestly, not yet. At least not from what I know. I think there are countries that are in positions to afford considerably better protection. But when we look at sort of proponents of animal rights, we still, and it's a growing proportion. It is, the movement is growing exponentially. These debates and these discussions are taking place in a lot of places that have the power to influence policy and to make laws and all of that. But it's starting slow. In terms of legal developments, I have seen, as I mentioned, a couple in India and in Pakistan and in America. There have been a few cases. I know for welfare protection, the EU is particularly good grounds, has fertile soil, so to speak, to implement sort of welfare protections for animals, not rights just yet, because there are practical obstacles, and that's something that will, I suppose, take time to eradicate, and it will be more of us will have to change our minds on our position, where we stand on animal rights for this to happen than currently do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question, knowing that countries also are different on points of view on animal rights, how to ally together to be on the same level to fight together? Can you say something about that?
So countries are different with their points of view.
Yeah, you know, because like every country is different.
Yes.
Is it possible for us to ally together to sort of get on like the same level, or?
I absolutely think it is possible, because countries also had considerably different standpoints on a lot of issues of human rights. So when we see movements, we see that they were considerably stronger in some countries. We see countries that have fabulous protection today for women, and countries that are still sort of lagging behind in that. And we see countries that have fabulous protection now for LGBTQI plus peoples, and then countries that are lagging, countries that are sort of penalizing homosexuality with the capital punishment even. So there are different viewpoints of peoples, of cultures, of communities, countries, and I think there's still a way to bring everybody together by identifying that. And this is true, I would think, of any movement. So I think when we emphasize that there are things that sort of matter more than our differences, and there are things that we need to protect in order to achieve a peaceful, kind world, that those would be ways. And another one is through trade, and this is more of a practical thing. So this is more of not through social movements and not through changing the minds of people, but another really important point, and I've kind of research into this, and it's something that I would use in my work, my NGO work, for instance, would be to emphasize trade links. Because the EU, for instance, when it banned animal testing, for cosmetic products, also prohibited the import of such products, and products that were produced through animal testing, cosmetics that were produced that way. And through that sort of thing, we have ways of kind of maybe multinational organizations. We also have things like the United Nations. You know, if once the United Nations had its Declaration of Human Rights, we saw that the idea that human rights were universal and available to everyone on an equal footing became an accepted thing. So, and it spread. So there could be things by international organizations which may have a role to play. There could be trade that countries do through strengthening their own protection and sort of prohibiting the import of things from countries that don't have it. And there could also be people who come together. We've got the internet now, and it's this fabulous forum for spreading ideas and for having these discussions and these talks, and for, and I think the internet's one of the ways that ideas spread the fastest, because people in different parts of the world have access to the same sort of space, and they can really come together that way. Long rambly answer that was.
That's okay. So we have some similar ones that are all about how do you plan to get policy changes? What would you start doing legally? Yeah, so I think if I understood you correctly, I think those are things that you will cover in your
Definitely.
presentation as well. Okay, so I think we will come to the end of our Q&A for now. I saw one interesting question. So in your opinion, have the laws in recent years really been changing in a way to improve the rights of animals, or have they rather changed in a way to reinforce the rights of the animal exploitation industries? Looking at ag-gag laws and legislation such as the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, it seems like we are certainly not winning this war against animal exploitation on the legal side.
So, and I don't have knowledge of all the jurisdictions that are out there, but in the bits that I have actually looked into, so I know, for instance, in European jurisdictions, so welfare, again, I wouldn't say animal rights laws, but I would say sort of welfare protection for animals has definitely been improving overall, and the regulatory things like gag laws and all of that is certainly a step back for animal protection, and it is a step forward for the protection of their exploiters. Overall, I would think that the world's actually having more of these discussions. Gag laws, from what I remember, were quite an issue in the United States of America, but also there have been a handful of cases where they sought to sort of, it was on question whether they should recognize the rights of non-human primates, I believe it was, and so there, and if you read those judgments, there's actually, you can see that the flow there is, I think they ultimately stopped for floodgates arguments for fear of opening the floodgates, but if you read those judgments, you can see that there definitely seems to be sympathy, because it is, as a matter of principle, it seems very difficult to deny some of the arguments raised in relation to these protections. So I think there are more steps forward in general than there are steps back, but, or so based on my knowledge of legal developments in the few jurisdictions in which I know. Mm-hmm. But I think it's easy to get because I think we tend to, our brains are sort of programmed to focus a little bit more on the negatives, and it's we can get kind of discouraged when we see these things, and it happens to me a lot. But just there are positive steps, and we are moving in general in the right direction, and that seems to be what the experts in the different countries I've spoken with all seem to agree on. So that is good news. It's just that we're moving slow, and I would love for us to move a lot faster.
Yes, of course, we all would. All right, so I think this is a good ending point for this presentation. I want to once again thank you again, Ankita, for this really interesting and wonderful presentation in the name of the whole ORGA team of the International Animal Rights Conference. Yeah, and thank you for helping us to learn more about these legal discrepancies. And in August, we hope to have some more pre-conference presentations coming up. This is just an info from the conference. So keep your eyes open for announcements via social media and the conference website. And please note that the registration of the International Animal Rights Conference 2020 is now open, so you can go ahead and register. And thank you all for joining. And please also join us for the digital conference on September 5th and 6th this year. And this is it for today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Ankita.
Thanks so much for having me.